Episode 13. The Death of the Messiah in Luke. Matthew follows Mark very closely in his account of how Jesus died. Where he develops the narrative, he often seems to be protecting his hearers from critical voices, calling the Christian version of events into question. He keeps much of the raw simplicity of Mark's account, including the terrible cry of abandonment from Psalm 22. A cry of abandonment which, for the reader, is also a moment of fulfillment and revelation. Luke, however, seems to have found some alternative narrative material in the course of his investigations. More importantly, his narrative reveals more explicitly than Mark what the cross means. In his account, Jesus' progress to the cross makes visible what that terrible journey achieves for humanity: reconciliation with the Father and the forgiveness of sins. We might read a hint of this in Luke's laconic mention of a reconciliation between Pilate and Herod after Jesus' trial. There may even be a hint of redemptive effects in Luke's summary at the end of the Roman trial. He released the one they asked for, who had been thrown into prison for revolution and murder, and handed Jesus over to their will. At one level, there is the tragic irony of the choice of the unjust judges. But we might also see a living metaphor for what Jesus' death, for the sake of sinners, achieves: release from prison, in spite of the weight of sin. As in the other synoptic Gospels, Simon of Cyrene is pressed into service and carries the crossbeam behind Jesus. But at this point, Luke invites us to see a large number of the people who are following him along with the women who are beating their breasts and wailing. This is no longer the crowd who shouted for his death. We are back with a favorite Lucan motif: the faithful people of God. The Laos who were waiting for his coming at the beginning of the Gospel. The Laos who hung on to his every word during his last week in Jerusalem. And of course, the people are not only the members of the mourning procession within the Gospel, they are also the faithful readers of the Gospel. Once again, the fourth wall disappears. All his people accompany Jesus on his last journey. However, just here, Luke's Jesus brings back the theme of eschatological judgment. Not the end of the world, but the end of the world as the people of the city know it. Jesus turns to the women of Jerusalem and engages with them. He speaks words of prophetic compassion, which echo his speech before the temple. Weep not for me, but for yourselves and your children. Destruction will fall on Jerusalem. However, Jesus takes no pleasure in this. Rather, he identifies the suffering of the holy city as an extension of his own. If they do this when the wood is green, what will they do when it is dry? At one level, he is repeating a critical prophetic judgment echoing Jeremiah. And yet, in context, his words carry a strange second meaning. They become an expression of solidarity. The burden of judgment is shared between the Messiah suffering in the moment and the people that will suffer at a later, but intimately connected turn of history. He is crucified at the place of the skull. No mention of the Aramaic name, with two criminals on the right and left. At this point, in most manuscripts, Luke's Jesus says, "Forgive them, Father, for they do not know what they are doing." Therein lies a powerful theological idea. Luke will return to it in the Acts of the Apostles. We need to think about it very carefully, because a simple reading of it is shocking. Throughout the Gospel of the Passion, there is a double narrative at work. There is God's plan to redeem the world through the death and resurrection of the Messiah, as prefigured in the Scriptures. And then there are the humans crucifying Jesus for their very human reasons, political, religious, or social. The implication is that in some sense all the actors in the drama, Pilate, Caiaphas, Judas, the Jerusalem crowds, are agents of the divine plan. They just don't realize it. Let's take the difficult bit first. We should allow ourselves to be suitably horrified by the thought that the ultimate agent of the crucifixion might be God, that the supremely good and merciful God could will the torture and death of anyone, let alone his only Son. We need therefore to notice that the way this theological narrative is presented contains countervailing strands which resist that terrible conclusion. The first is that the point of Jesus' words is not about transferring blame. It is about forgiveness. He is revealing the whole point of his mission. For that mission to be fulfilled, following the words of Scripture, the Messiah had to suffer and die. Whatever role humans may have played in that mission, for good or for evil, they can be forgiven, because that is precisely why the mission took place. The gospel leaves us with unresolved but creative tensions around the meaning of had to in the Messiah had to suffer and die. Later, Christian theological systems will try to work through those tensions and usually fail. If there is a necessity here, it will be not a necessity that arises from God's will, but a necessity that arises because this is the only way to fulfill God's will. But that, of course, raises as many theological questions as it resolves. Let's just notice two accounts of the Father's will which pull in different directions. First, it is the Father's will that the Son should go through suffering in order to enter his glory. But then, when the Jerusalem leadership condemns the Son to death, they are rejecting God's promises to his people. Indeed, they are responsible for the divine judgment about to fall on the city that rejects him. So what was God's will? For the Messiah to be accepted, hence his punishment of Jerusalem for not accepting him, or for the Messiah to be rejected and crucified? As we've just seen, the judgment on Jerusalem is a version of the classical narrative from Deuteronomy, that God will punish those who reject him, or in this case, who reject his Messiah. However, that narrative of judgment as an expression of God's will is already challenged and transmuted by Jesus' expression of solidarity with the victims. Weep not for me, but for yourselves and your children. But it is fully and paradoxically subverted here as Jesus is being crucified. Jesus prays for the forgiveness for the perpetrators, a forgiveness that only the crucifixion itself can bring about. Let's return to what Luke is making us see. The people stand watching. Once again, elements of the Markan narrative come through. The mockery is there. He saved others. He cannot save himself. However, it doesn't come from the passers-by. It comes from the elite, the rulers, and from the soldiers. If you are king of the Jews, save yourself. In Mark's Gospel, offering vinegar was a response to Jesus' cry and an echo of Psalm 69. The psalm reference is preserved. But in Luke, the offering of vinegar or sour wine is now part of the mockery. But Luke then takes Mark's laconic description in a transformative direction. In Mark we read, "And the two bandits insulted him as well." Luke enhances this scene to reveal Jesus' mission bearing fruit while he is still on the cross. One of the two criminals joins in the insults. If he is the Christ, he should save himself and his two fellow victims of crucifixion. Thus, for a third time, the mockery focuses on the crucial gospel word, soson se, save yourself. Remember that phrase in so many healing narratives in Luke? Your faith has saved you. The mockery drives home the apparent reality that Jesus' saving mission has met ultimate failure. However, the second criminal turns things upside down. Have you no fear of God? He recognizes Jesus as the just one. He and his companion are justly condemned, but Jesus has done no wrong. And he recognizes Jesus not merely as the just man whose soul is in the hand of God, but as the true Messiah, entering his kingdom in spite of the brutal evidence to the contrary. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus' response articulates what your faith has saved you means most deeply. Here is a rescue that takes us beyond time and history. Today, you will be with me in paradise, the promise of the new Eden. Forgiveness, reconciliation, eternal life are already being accomplished for this sinner, representing every sinner who has faith and accompanies the Messiah in his death. As in Mark, there is darkness for 3 hours. Luke tries to offer an intelligible physical explanation and suggests an eclipse of the sun. As we have seen, this explanation cannot work at Passover. But it does suggest that Luke's audience expects the narrative to have a certain intrinsic plausibility within the frame of educated understandings of the cosmos. At the end of the darkness, the veil of the temple is torn down the middle. Notice that in Luke, this takes place before Jesus' death. The old world is ending while Jesus is still alive, in the same way that the work of salvation is already taking place while he is still on the cross. Strikingly, Luke's Jesus does not call out the terrible words of abandonment of Psalm 22. Instead, Luke transforms Jesus' final cry in a loud voice from Mark. He overlays it with words from Psalm 31. Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. He gives the meaning of Jesus' last breath, a return to the Father of the gift that was given. Jesus' death is not passive. It is not about loss, the radical and painful destruction of the old. It is active gift, the beginning of the new in seamless continuity with what has gone before. At this moment, Luke's centurion, like Mark's, is filled with awe and wonder. Matthew's centurion, we can remember, reacted with holy terror. In Luke, however, he praises God, though instead of "this was a son of God," we hear, "Truly, this was a just man." Why the shift? Perhaps Luke finds this a more plausible phrase to come from the tongue of a non-Jew. Perhaps he wants to avoid the ambiguities of the phrase "Son of God" on Gentile lips. Or perhaps he wants to highlight the identity of Jesus with the figure of the just one of the Book of Wisdom, rescued by God from the false judgment of his detractors. The souls of the just are in the hands of God. The crowds, they are crowds rather than people now, who have watched and witnessed, now return, beating their breasts. They mourn the death of the just one. We will meet the crowds again in the Acts of the Apostles, when Peter speaks in the days after Pentecost in Jerusalem. As he recalls the details of the crucifixion, they will be cut to the quick. Peter will remind them of events they have witnessed. But here in the Gospel, the crowds that leave in mourning are only beginning to see dimly. They know they have witnessed a tragedy, the death of a prophet and healer sent by God. They know that he was innocent. They cannot yet see the promise that lies beyond. Luke adds another distinctive and significant detail. Among the witnesses are those known to him. It seems that at least some of the male disciples, who were conspicuous by their absence in Mark's account, are present alongside the women. Luke has no interest in downplaying the role of the male disciples. Indeed, their role will become central in the early drama of the new Christian community in the Acts of the Apostles. In the account of the burial, once again we see Joseph of Arimathea asking Pilate for the body and burying it in a carved-out tomb, after wrapping it in a winding sheet. As in Mark, Joseph is awaiting the kingdom. The women, as in the other Gospels, witness where and how the body was laid. Luke adds a couple of subtle but important details. Joseph was a member of the council, but had not consented to the council's decision and its action. The women returned to prepare spices and myrrh, but because the next day is the Sabbath, they rest, obedient to the commandment. Luke's emphasis on the obedience to the Sabbath commandment reminds his readers, Jewish and non-Jewish, that Jesus' disciples belong to the faithful people of God. Jesus' movement is in continuity with the whole of salvation history. From Anna to Zechariah, the figures Luke presents at the time of his birth are awaiting the coming of God's kingdom and are fully obedient to the Torah. So too with the women present at the time of his death. They are faithful Jews who remain obedient to the law of the Lord, whose promise of salvation is about to be fulfilled. They observe the Sabbath. The day God rests after creation, the new creation, has been completed.